big deals, and also transportation issues were big at the time because from the earliest days, Federal Way has been a bedroom community, and so people had to get to work, and there were people concerned about how to get there using public transportation. Another issue that was floated from time to time was the idea of incorporation. I recall working on it personally, going from house to house, educating people about the pros and cons of incorporation. And this is in the mid-'70s.
I think there were 14 attempts, either abortive or real, to put the cityhood thing together. Some of them were, they really failed fast, others more ambitiously. Another important fact, both during Ken's tenure and mine, was the failure of school levies.
Yes.
22 consecutive levies were brought forward and failed in Federal Way while the schools were rotting and kids were getting, in effect, underserved. Facilities were not being updated. School safety, the adequacy of the laboratories, the music rooms, everything that a school counts on was suffering. Then Milt Snyder came to town, a very important bellwether superintendent who had a kind of pep talk, energetic cheerleader kind of a style, and he rallied the troops. But when two people who were leaders of the citizen effort to get the levy passed in '81, Frank and Marjorie, I'm not getting their names right now, it'll come, Guthrie, Frank Guthrie, a Weyerhaeuser executive, and Marjorie were really amazing people. And they led the campaign that finally got a levy passed, and that was so important for Federal Way schools to bring them up to speed. When they were asked what made the difference in that passage, it was newspaper coverage in the Federal Way News, and editorial support from the Federal Way News was the #1 factor given. And I mention that not as a point of pride, but because it shows the relationship between a newspaper and its community. As Ken said, he was out there on the streets. And the fact that most papers that are small like that way have that kind of close engagement with people is what distinguishes the newspaper, the Community Weekly, from the big Seattle Times or any big daily, the engagement and involvement of the people with the issues that are around them.
One of the visible things that got people's attention during that time about the non-passage of the school levies was that none of the lawns in front of the school administration and the other schools were being mowed, and so the grass got quite tall. And it was disturbing to people to see that. They thought it was a sign of civic irresponsibility, or at least school district irresponsibility. And I think that physical manifestation is the thing that drove people to decide to support it also.
And very, very much true, and other things like that, the ceiling tiles falling off,
Yeah, right.
that kind of stuff. But to flash forward to later in the time we were there, crime was a big deal. A detective was killed.
What about the teachers' strike?
It wasn't such a big deal.
You didn't cover that?
We covered
Yeah,
it, but
we
it
covered
wasn't.
it,
It
yeah.
didn't stand in comparison with the things that had really riveted attention. Detective name, I think Sam Hicks might have been his name, King County Sheriff, was killed by a man who was out of prison and had escaped, and Hicks was one of the first to try to track him down, and he got shot. That was a very big deal. A young woman, was a 17-year-old girl, maybe 16, was killed sitting behind Federal High School. That was a very big story. Her killer was never caught. That's
Yarborough,
right, Sarah
yeah, that's
Yarborough. The healthcare field, I guess you could say the hospital issue. I don't want to just say hospital because adequate healthcare was the bigger driver, and so there were a number of efforts to bring a local hospital. 3 contenders, National Medical Enterprises, NME, Swedish, St. Francis or Franciscans, and I think Multicare were the contenders in the early '80s. The citizens really got involved with the HSA and the whole process of getting a hospital built. I wish some of those people were here because they should get credit for the work they did. Federal Way has a very good hospital now, the Franciscan system, because of that effort. And the issue was how far did you have to drive and how many minutes did you have to wait for a heart attack to be treated if you lived in Federal Way. You could go to Auburn or Tacoma. Forget Seattle. It was like 32 minutes. So it's really nice to have that facility here for young mothers and for people who have a chronic illness and for people who have a cardiological incident. It saved many lives, countless lives since then. So that was a big deal. Schools, I mentioned. The fact that we had our own police force when the county transitioned from county management of the cops. I remember sitting next to a cop one night in the King County Courthouse, and he was asked about police coverage in Federal Way at the time. This was prior to cityhood by about a year. And he said, we just tell them whatever we want them to hear. And the fact is, we just drive a car through there once in a while. He was being somewhat cynical, but the truth was, police coverage at that time wasn't anywhere near what it is now. So the idea that you have close and adequate and dedicated coverage was a big deal and a big reason why people wanted cityhood in the first place. And then Ken mentioned transportation. A related field is the roads themselves and the maintenance of the roads. I still remember a man standing up in a public meeting at Decatur High School saying, "We don't want them damn potholes fixed. They keep the people out of here." Well, that was at a time when Federal Way was growing by 18% per year. But that was the mythology. The antis were very, very vehement. They thought there'd be one campaign featured parking tickets on fake windshields of every car in town because anywhere you parked, you'd have a ticket, allegedly, if we had a city. Well, obviously that isn't the case, but anything that could be done to keep it from happening. People from Redondo didn't want to be in, people from down at, all the way to Des Moines, really, and so that's why Redondo's part of Des Moines now, because of some people living down there who said, we don't want anything to do with Federal Way. So the rivalries were a big deal. We covered that over and over and over again. There were more things, but
So the
That's
newspaper
highlights.
holds a lot of sway in how they approach a subject, how they present it. Can you speak to that?
sure. Let me put it this way, though, because in 1985, our newspapers were attacked on the floor of the Republican convention for King County as left-wing rag, and in the same year attacked on the floor of the Democratic convention as being a right-wing rag. So the point is, yeah, I mean, that made me laugh heartily because we weren't either. We were pretty much in the middle, but we had strong views, and if we didn't like something or it didn't seem to benefit our community, we were very pro-community, but not, we might have been left of the middle, but we weren't anything like the Republicans were calling us. We've endorsed Paul Barden in the same year that we endorsed Dan Evans, in the same year that we endorsed some.
Pete von Reichbauer.
Right, and we
Those
don't
guys
know
are
what
all
he is.
Republicans. Yeah.
Okay. What characters shaped Federal Way?
Well, that's a great question. Can you name any?
Sure, I can name C. Ralph Fleming, who was a prominent realtor here in the early days, and whose wife, Nellie Fleming, carried on his tradition of community activism and participation, and did so until very recently. I actually lost touch with her, and
She passed away.
okay.
That's why.
Yeah.
Other
She
people,
stopped calling
Byron Betts,
Big deal.
was a big deal here, and I recall one day when I was a reporter at the Federal Way News in the early '70s, he came to me and said, I want to start this kind of a water park thing here. I can let you in for $5,000. I didn't even I had a $35 car at the time, so I didn't really have any money to get into make an investment, and that later became Wild Waves. And other people,
Marx.
what?
Francis
Well, the
Marx.
Marx family, but I didn't actually know the Marx family. They preceded me in time, and they were much
And
older.
followed.
Mhm.
They both preceded you and followed, because Francis had that
Yeah.
fixation about the water recovery.
Yeah.
And so then he kind of went dormant for a while in the midst of all the cityhood effort, and
Mhm.
came back on. No human being deserves more credit for Hylebo's water, the wetlands, than Francis. He
Yeah, yeah.
epitomizes what that was about. It's a wonderful
I
place.
agree. Yeah.
He made it happen, and his wife was just as feisty. There were some characters called the Atomics that preceded all of this.
Yes.
They had a roadhouse in the days when the only place to go from Portland to Seattle was there was a place there you could stop and have a beer and a sandwich and
Roughly at 348th and 99.
near Trout Lake, and they were accused of being left-wing pinko commies, and I think even the McCarthy people looked at them at one point. That's kind of how that was their reputation.
We certainly have to include J.R. Cisna, who developed the first shopping center in this state, the Federal Way Shopping Center. as a historic figure and an important character in the development of the community. I think it really helped draw attention to Federal Way from a wide region and bring people out here who wanted to shop, but also to live. And at the time, Federal Way was characterized by a lot of city farms or people with livestock in their yards out here. This is, of course, this preceded any development by Weyerhaeuser. West Campus was just woods at the time. And so he was a real pioneer in terms of commercial development in the community. Other than that, there was a man named Ben Robertson.
Ben and Juvie,
Mm-hmm. And
First Chamber Evergreen
yes, they were
Business
involved.
Club.
Yes, they started a business club in the community. We're very active in that. Ben was a dealer in old cars, as I recall.
Gorgeous old classic cars.
How about Doug Clergett?
And Doug Clergett.
In many ways, Doug would be more important than Ben. Ben was the little pixie, the little firebrand, the little spark plug. But Doug had a vision. And so when his dad brought him up here in the late 40s with his brother and said, "You want this ground up here?" Because his father was a farmer, but sort of a buyer, a developer. Doug said, "No, we want to be with you, Pop, down in the valley, down in Sumner." "Okay, but you're going to be sorry, goddammit." That's Doug's story. And what happened was they bought some ground down in Sumner, and then later came up, and I think the land was $200 an acre in those days, something really ridiculous. So he owned all the ground near what you now think of as Costco, all that land going west past 99 and north. Let's see how far north. A good deal of the chunk of land all around that. He had the truck stop there. He kept a beautiful house. His family may still own it about a mile south of the intersection at 348th
And he was
Highway.
very instrumental in getting Highway 18 built.
Yeah, he was a road builder. He had a wife who passed away, or maybe they divorced, I don't know. But Faye Clergett, who became his wife in probably the
She may
late
still be
60s or
alive.
70s, yeah, Faye's around,
Yeah.
was driving north with a trailer of her goods. She was, I think, a nurse, and she spotted this guy driving a D6 Caterpillar around and thought he was a hunk of a man. This is, again, a story from Doug, and decided that she would stop and say hi to him, and they ended up getting married, and she became a very important person during the whole period from probably the 70s to the 90s around two issues: the culture of Federal Way, including the symphony and the arts, and of course cityhood, and the hospital. She and Doug both served on the hospital, and I think they were on the board of what was then called Sound Bank, which was at the intersection of roughly 324th and 99. So they were involved in many, many things at a somewhat higher level than Ben and Juvie were.
Going back to the newspaper itself, how many photographers and reporters did you have? And we already talked about the circulation, but how many people were on
Yeah.
the Federal Way?
Well, from his time in the 70s to mine, they grew. Just the Federal Way outfit had, as I said, 3 photographers, 2 part-timers, what are called stringers in the newspaper business, which is people that just go out and maybe cover one thing for you because you just don't have enough people. You probably had a dozen of those doing sports and city council meetings and Lake Haven Sewer District and whatever. And we probably had about 9 reporters and 2 editors, assistant editor and a managing editor. Then we had a food writer, a sports editor, assistant sports writer,
Social, church.
yeah, church news.
And you had 5 ad staff and about that many people in the production department doing typesetting and page production, and then front office staff. I think there were
We had
3
700 carrier kids at one point from our whole operation, delivering papers from Alki to, you were one of them?
No, my kids.
They were?
I
Well, you
did-
could be.
I actually did West Seattle Herald when I was a kid.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's right, we
Yeah.
talked about that.
We're proud of that fact because when you have that many kids, you're penetrating the community in a very important way. So many people will stop us at the Safeway or whatever and say, "Hey, I used to carry that paper."
Actually, White Center News, yeah.
White Center, Burien, West Seattle, and we trained them. And I still remember when we wrote the circulation carrier training book, we did it with cartoons because we were afraid if we didn't do it with cartoons, they wouldn't read it. So we showed them how a paper shouldn't be thrown on the porch and how it should be, how to deal with a dog, how to ask a lady politely for the collection. All that stuff was all put together with our staff artist. That was kind of fun.
We had a couple of questions. A lot of papers in the 80s really downsized their news departments and tried to maximize their profits. I think it was part of everybody getting gobbled up by everybody else in the 80s. Did that affect your papers at all?
We didn't do that. We did just the opposite. We added staff and added pages and added coverage. So,
That's a great question, though, because what a kind of a quiet piece of that is that, bearing in mind that we paid about $445 a week to a full-time reporter, that was about half what you could make at a daily. So they were paying a lot bigger ticket for the same work, and so in a way, that's why we could stay in there and keep pitching.
but on a weekly newspaper, the workload is a little bit different for individuals. You actually have to produce more copy working on a weekly than you do on a daily. When you have a smaller staff, you have to do more jobs. You might have to be the photographer. You have to turn in more stories than you might have to if you're working on a daily newspaper, where you just have to turn in maybe, a couple of stories a week, where you a larger staff and more time to work on individual stories. Here, you have to crank out a lot of copy to fill those big spaces in the paper. So that was kind of our
Can I
policy and practice.
address the question, if we move forward about 30 years from 85 to say 205, right at the start of the most recent recession, I think in late 2007, it started to impact everybody. Businesses were closing, so what that means is a loss of revenue to everyone, not just us. So it does force you to look for ways to save money. One of the things we used to do years ago was produce what was called a Metro page. The dailies all had them. We all opened them. You read a paper this wide. Well, then, when '98, when we came back into the business after having sold it in '89, we went right to a tabloid size. Easier to read, but it's half the size of a Metro. So you save money in production costs. The value of newsprint was up, the tonnage rate was higher, so it cost more to produce. So we went with tabloid. As the recession hit in '07 and '08, the upshot of that is that we just simply cut our number of pages down. We didn't have as many ads to fill. You have a percentage that you try to do in the newspaper business of 70%